introduction. Panelists, thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers, to Dr. Noy, to Abdul, to the 10th Assembly Hall, to the Center for Chinese Business Studies. No, it's all right. I think it's the title of my class. I think it's okay. I want to stand here because I want to see the screen, otherwise it's too difficult to do. But normally when I speak at the podium, at the rostrum like this, I would ask for some kind of a low platform at the bottom so that I can see. But then since I don't have to be seen but just be heard, I think that's all right. Anyway, first of all, I would like to thank you all very much. Having a conference, a very important conference like this, during the time of festivities like Hari Raya, is quite a challenge, especially for the speakers. And as you can see, my paper just arrived this morning, hot, still very hot on the plate. So the aspect that you have in the proceedings have been somewhat modified because of my writing the full paper. But nevertheless, the key ideas are still the same. I think the project on historical thoughts, as envisioned by the Inter-Asia School, I think it's a very important project, a very worthwhile and significant project historically for the region, for Malaysia, for Singapore, for Southeast Asia, because I think we have not focused that much on thoughts or ideas, indigenous ideas in the region that are very critical, very crucial in shaping the histories, the trajectory, the evolution of various nations in the region. We have been focusing quite a lot on ideas coming out from outside. Yes, that is important, but nevertheless, it's also very important to look inside what kind of ideas that have evolved historically. So I think that this is a very worthwhile project. Now, what I plan to do for this morning is I have, well, when I first showed it to some of my friends the title, so his response was, oh, Revisiting Malaya, Envisioning the Nation, the History of Ideas, and the Idea of History is not a tongue twister. But it is also a thought twister. I think it provokes our thinking. And I cannot guarantee that I have answered the questions, but I think at least I am provoking some thoughts about why we need to look into the history of ideas and what do we understand as the idea of history, and with particular reference to revisiting Malaya. Now I want to focus on 4 issues, given the time limitation, and I think we should have time for discussion. First is what Dr. Daniel has already mentioned briefly, that what has been the debate, especially among historians, on the concept of nation. Is it imagined or is it conceptualized? I think that is the first thing. Second, the contestations about the idea of the Malay world, the Malay archipelago and Malaya. I will take that up too, because I think that is very important to frame our discussion on the emergence of nations in this part of the world, especially in Malaysia, in Malaya, and also in Indonesia. And the third part is post-World War II developments, especially on the contestations on the ideas of nation-making after the Second World War. And I want to focus a bit on the ideas put forward by the Constitutional Working Committee proposed by the British, the Malay rulers, representative, and UMNO, and versus the ideas proposed by the Putra AMCJA United Front. And the last part is some kind of conclusion to bring back to the idea of history and the history of ideas, the history of ideas and the idea of history. Okay, let's move on. I don't want to talk about this, but I think in the introductory speeches just now it was mentioned that we are at a very critical crossroads in the country today, where never in the history of the country that the tensions and the contestations between the different political ideas, political views and ideologies have been pushed We have, for example, the place of the Malay supremacy, the Ketuhanan Melayu ideas, trying to assert the question of firstness, using history to assert the idea of firstness in order to promote exclusionary politics. And on the other hand, we also do read and hear sometimes that the Malays cannot claim that they are indigenous also because they are also immigrants. I think both ideas are wrong, and I want to show why these ideas are not helpful in the course of our discussion. But in the scholarly discussion, in the books and articles on the question of nation, there has been also a lot of debate on the question of emergence of nations, nation building, about the Malay world and all that. And I think this is very good. I think we have historians in this hall, Professor Embong, Professor Wong, and many others are here. I'm not a historian, I'm a sociologist, as I pointed out. But as a sociologist who is interested in history, and I think history is not a monopoly of anybody. We all can I mean, there are various histories, so to speak, with various branding histories. So I think this debate about what a nation, how we should see a nation, how is it being defined and all that, I think this debate is very good. It will help enrich our understanding of the concept. Now, let me begin with the first question. Is nation imagined or conceptualized? I think many of us are very familiar with the work, with the classic by Ben Anderson. Imagined Communities, first published in 1983, republished many times, and it's one of the top most cited books in the world. One of the top most cited books after Kuhn's The Scientific Revolution. Ben Anderson has come to Malaysia, has been to ICMAS, we discussed this idea again with him. Now, Anderson argues that nations are socially constructed and that they are imagined by the people who perceive themselves as part of that group. And he argues further that an imagined community is different from an actual community because for practical reasons we do not know everybody in that community. But the point that he emphasizes is that we have a mental image of people who we regard as part of that community called nation. And the factors that have enabled the idea of the nation or the imagination of the nation are the emergence of capitalism and more significantly the idea of trade capitalism. We have the media, people can read the same language, so they can have an idea that okay, this group of people are part and parcel of my nation, of my bangsa. I think that is basically Ben's and I'm not doing justice to him, but just be very brief to present to you his idea. Now, as you know, his ideas were based on a study of European history. The emergence of nations in European history is different from the emergence of nations in our part of the world. But nevertheless, it is a good starting point to talk about. Now, we have another scholar who also engages with the idea of nation. And just now, as I mentioned, is currently attached to the Institute of Southeast Asia, Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Kuala Lumpur, and he comes here very often, and also has been to ICMAS. Now, his argument in his book, The Invention of Politics in Colonial Malaya, he argues that it is not very correct to say that nations are emerging. Now, his reference is to the Malay world, especially to Malaya. Why? According to him, nations are conceptualized. It's not just imagination. It is conceptualization by the leaders, by the thinkers, about what should constitute the nation in this part of the world. Imagination is too light, according to him. The energy, the passion, the commitment of the leaders in order to construct the nation, it is more fitting to call it conceptualization rather than imagination. So there you are. His argument is that the concept of imagination tends to disguise the anxiety, the experimentation, the contest, and the sheer intellectual difficulty faced by those who relinquish their loyalty to older forms of community, meaning the kerajaan, the Sultanate, and constructed a new form. Okay. Now, in my view, whether nations are imagined or whether they are conceptualized, we are talking about the same thing, this entity called nation. And I feel that both positions are right in their own ways. Because I think you need to imagine first. And then you can construct or you conceptualize. And that is why I use the term envision. Envisioning the nation, which tries to integrate both the ideas of imagination and also the ideas of conceptualization. So, and I think based on the history of our country, of Malaya, the imagination is there, the conceptualization is there. Okay. Now that's the first point that I want to make clear. Now the second point is about the Malay world. The Malay archipelago or Nusantara, some people call it, but in this paper I call it the Malay world because I want to link it later on with the idea of Melayu Raya. Now there is also a debate whether the Malay world did it really exist, or whether there was a kerajaan world. Orang use the kerajaan world, Sultanate world. The people use the term Malay world. The question arose, was the Malay world and Melayu Raya the figment of imagination of nationalist fighters like Ibrahim Yaakob, Mustafa Hussein, Isa bin Muhammad, Al-Halmi, Mustamam, and so on and so forth. The idea to have a greater unified state of Malaya and Indonesia. Was it a figment of the imagination, or was there a basis in history for that idea of the Malay world? Now let us look into some historical sources. Now Yanan Andaya in his book, Leaves of the Same Tree. Andaya, I think many of us know, as a historian in the University of Hawaii, who has written many books on the history of Malaysia. Now, in this book, he argues that there has been a coherence and continuity in Malay history. And he talked about the Malayu, not Malayu, Malayu, as it's spelled, has existed for a long time, and refers to a people with maritime civilization built around what has been known as the Sea of Malayu. They are familiar with the states of Malacca. But the Sea of Malayu is quite, the name is not that familiar, right? But according to him, the Sea of Malayu, the first of reference of the Sea of Malayu is from an Arabic document dated 1000, which noted that travelers reaching the Sea of Malayu were approaching the area of China. Although the Arabic document is not specific, the general reference to a Sea of Malayu approaching the area of China is an accurate description of the extensive network view as one sea stretching from India to Vietnam. And it explains further that the Sea of Malayu refers to the voyaging corridor, the corridor of voyagers and travelers from the Indian subcontinent, the Southeast Asian Isthmus, and the northern Malay Peninsula and the shores of the South China Sea. And it goes to the Straits of Malacca, which for more than 2,000 years was the principal route through Southeast Asia, and communities located along the shores were the major beneficiaries of the steady flow of commercial traffic. Now that is the gist of the ideas of Yanan Andaya, who says that the Melayu has existed. There was a name Malayu in history, perhaps for 2,000 years or so, and that they were maritime people, they were travelers, voyagers, and so on and so forth. Though, of course, in other books they say that the term Melayu is a more recent invention, related to Palembang, Malacca, and all that. But according to him, it existed before. That the different ethnicities in the region and all. Now, Anthony Milner has a different view. Now, he acknowledges that these groups who were later came to be identified as Malay has existed from early centuries and have engaged in cultural as well as commercial and political relations in numerous directions. But Milner's point is that the problem of coherence and continuity between what was claimed by Andaya of the Malayu of the earlier times with the Malayu of the later period. So according to him, evidence is not that strong to link the continuity. So he says, despite the impression communicated by much of the work in Malay studies, coherence is not the fact, is not the hallmark of Malay communities and historical heritage. And that the evidence of earlier centuries does not allow us to speak of Malay with such confidence. So, this is according to him, right? Now, Andaya has a different view. That is evidence. Now, anyway, to go further, now based on the study of various sources, especially of Malay texts, Malay manuscripts, Milner argues that Melayu or Malays is a civilizational concept, not so much an ethnic concept, as argued by Andaya. And he argues that the expression of the Malay world, Dunia Melayu, is misleading to refer to that. And it might be more accurate to speak of a Kerajaan world or the Sultanate world. So, Caesar Kemal historians also, there's a lot of debate on this big issue. Now, as I said, I'm not a historian, but I'm sticking my neck out on this. And both of them all of them are my personal friends anyway. They like to argue. I think Milner is right in some ways. That there has been Kerajaan world. Kerajaan Melaka, Kerajaan Majapahit, Kerajaan Palembang, Sriwijaya, and many others. And that some of these kerajaans were small, some were big, and some big ones like the Sriwijaya managed to extend beyond Palembang, beyond Sumatra into the Malay Peninsula. Malacca also managed to go beyond just the peninsula into Sumatra and all that. There were attempts at trying to unify, based on the Sultanates, trying to unify parts of the region. Because they were considered as kith and kin among the sultans themselves. And I think it's here that the concept of cultural zone is relevant. How do we explain this? There were many kingdoms, some speaking Malay, some speaking Japanese, but similar cultures, lots of interaction with others and so on. But according to Milner, we cannot talk about the Malay world because they are Kerajaan world and there are no term of Malay even then. Now my view is that this region is a cultural zone in the sense used by Brodel. And within cultural zone, you can have many sultanates. Now, a cultural zone as defined by anthropologists, I'm quoting Brodel now, is an area within which one group of cultural characteristics is dominant. There are many cultural characteristics, but you can have some dominant. Right? So, I don't want to go into details on this, but we can discuss later. But so the point is that if we consider, we agree that this is a cultural zone, that this area called Malay Archipelago, or the Malay world, or Nusantara is a cultural zone, then the existence of various sultanates within the cultural zone, I think is natural, is logical. So you can have the sultanate world, but the sultanate world exists within the Malay world. And that is my argument. Now here, and you can have that world, that cultural zone, even though the name Malay may not have been used then yet at that time. Now I want to draw some parallels on this subject with Chinese history. Now, before the unification of China by the Han dynasty, under the Han dynasty before about 2,000 years or more ago, and also before the Qing dynasty and then later by the Han dynasty, the lands and peoples of China, I mean there were separate kingdoms or empires under the Qing and under the various dynasties in China. Various ethnic groups, various tribal groups, some were at war with one another and all that. But they were unified under the Qing and subsequently under the Han. And Shi Huangdi was the first emperor who unified. Right? Now I stand corrected here, I'm not an expert on history, but my reading of it is, that's my understanding of it. Now these dynasties laid the foundation for a unified China, established a centralized empire and a bureaucracy. And it is on the basis of this unified empire and of this bureaucracy, based on the philosophy of Confucius and so on, that in the early 20th century, Sun Yat-sen led the democratic revolution and set up the Republic of China in 1911. Overthrew the last emperor, ended the 2,000 years of imperial rule. But was the name China used during the Han? In my view, no. The name China and Chinese came later. Using that parallel, using that in the same way, I think we can argue that even though the name Malay may not have been used to refer to the area that we today call the Malay world, I think it's still valid to argue. Because very often, there have been cases in history where facts and practices took place first, occurred prior to concepts. Concepts sometimes were coined later. I call this knowledge lag or conceptual lag, a cognitive or intellectual dissonance between ideas and reality. We do not know what to call it, but we practice it. But sometimes, of course, ideas come first, and then you try to invent it, you try to create it. But I think in this particular context, the fact and practices happened, and then the name later on was created or invented to refer to the concept. So, to sum up, I think the Malay world was a historical reality, and Malaya as an idea had evolved as part of the Malay historical consciousness. I think that's the historical basis of that. And that it was an idea that underpins the envisioning of the Malay nation of intent. Nation of intent, not the nation of realization. And the first person, I think, in Malaysia who used the term nation of intent was the late Ustam Sani, long time ago. In his work on the origin of the Malay life. And the Malay nation of the envisioning of the Malay nation of intent, the Malaya, was to reconnect the two territories, Malaya and Indonesia, that were separated by the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1824. And that historical migration among the peoples of the region at that time, before the establishment of political borders, of the modern state borders, were regarded as normal movements of people. And to say that if they come from, say, Sumatra into Malaya, during that period, to call them being immigrant, I think is not right. Because movements of people at that time were very natural. Until when state borders were created, then that's different. When there are official state borders or there are immigrant rules, then that's different. Okay, I think that is the first two parts that I want to talk about. Now I want to move on very quickly into the post-Second World War developments, which I think which are very vital for understanding, perhaps understand the post-Merdeka developments. Now, I just want to say quickly about the significance of the First World War and the Second World War in the history of the region. I think historians and scholars have said that both World Wars, World War I and World War II, have been instrumental in ending an old era and ushering a new one. For example, the First World War, 1914-1918, saw the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Caliphate based in Istanbul, collapse of the Habsburg Empire, Tsarist Russia, the economic ruins of Europe, and the rise of the United States to eventually become the most powerful nation, and the ushering of what is known later on as the American century. The First World War also saw the birth of the first socialist state, the Soviet Union, the birth and expansion of some communist parties in some countries, the stirrings of nationalism, and the emergence of independent struggles, and also the birth of several new nation states, such as modern Turkey, led by Kemal Atatürk. And also, the First World War had impacts upon, besides political and economic impacts. And by the way, this is the 100th anniversary of the First World War, centenary of the First World War, and my institute, ICMAS, is organizing the centenary conference next week. First World War centenary conference, I mentioned about it just now. But I want to relate here that among the impacts of the First World War on Malayan politics then, besides the Singapore mutiny in 1915, in February 1915, was a Tok Janggut uprising of the Chia Bung King has written on this. I read this piece and I found it fascinating. And the fact that the uprising was not just about the taxes, the land taxes and all that, but it was connected to the First World War, to the fight between the Ottoman Empire and the Western powers. And there were rumors that the European forces were defeated by the Muslim Ottomans. The Indian mutiny, the mutinies in Singapore believed that too. They refused to fight with the Allied forces, with the Western powers, because they said, how can we not fight against the Muslim brothers and sisters? So Tok Janggut and his followers, besides rebelling against British imposition of taxes and so on, also had the idea that this is a jihad, as issued by a scholar, the venerable scholar in Turkey, that this is a jihad impact. So that impact, I think that is very important. But you want the details, you have to read Professor Chabon's article on this. I think that's what the First World War. Now the Second World War, or more so the specific war, 1941-45 for us, this caused a pivotal change for Southeast Asia and for Malaya. And what is important is the defeat of the colonial powers, the British, the French, the Dutch, and all that, by the Japanese, shattered the myth of European invincibility and the white man's superiority. And the method from the nationalist movement was like, it gave confidence to the nationalists that Asians could take the destiny in their own hands to fight for independence. And I think that was what inspired, among others, people like Sukarno, Hatta in Indonesia, Ibrahim Yaakob, Mustamam, Burhanuddin, Mustafa Hussein, and all that in Malaya, to align with the Japanese to fight against the Western powers for independence. I think it was, why Western powers wanted to mobilize people for the anti-fascist United Front, but the nationalists in Indonesia, in Malaya, in India, aligned with the Japanese. And that is what intriguing. Now, just to go over quickly, this slide is very familiar. The plan then was, the Melayu Raya champions was to declare independence together between Indonesia and Malaya within the framework of Melayu Raya or Indonesia Raya. To declare it in August. The meeting was in Taipei between Sukarno, Hatta, Ibrahim Yaakob, Mustafa Hussein, and all that in 1945. But of course, it failed. The Malay national intent, the Melayu Raya as a national intent failed, mainly because, I say mainly because, but not the only cause, mainly because of the sudden defeat of the Japanese. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the Americans. The plan could not be realized. The British came back, they occupied Malaya 2 weeks later, and some of the champions or advocates of Melayu Raya like Ibrahim Yaakob, Onan Haji Siraj, and a number of others escaped to Indonesia to continue the struggle. So that, in a way, ended that phase of struggle about Melayu Raya as the nation of intent. That idea of having the two territories to be declared as one. Okay, then the other phase, I think, which has direct relevance to us in post-independence. Now, how much time? 10 to 15 minutes. 10 minutes. Okay, I will try to. This one thing, otherwise I should move faster. Okay, after that, you can see the nationalist tide became and was formed in October 1945, and various other organizations like Angkatan Wanggesda, Angkatan Pemerintah South, and all that. Now the key question after the Second World War was, what kind of new state should Malaya be? Now the British came with the Malayan Union. Of course it was a coup. Now should it be a union or should it be a federation? Should it be a monarchy or should it be a republic? These were questions. Should it be a democracy? If so, what kind of democracy? Now, the big question was, in the context of Malaya, Peninsular Malaya, there are 9 Malay kingdoms, there were 3 state sovereignties. Right? There was extant or state parochialism was strong. If you read William Law's book, he said, Henry Penda's introduction forward to William Law's book, trying to get people to unite to fight the British on a nationalist agenda was like to light fire on the wet wood, kayu yang basah. That was the expression. I don't agree with that, but that was the impression they, that people like Rock and Harry Bender got this question. But the idea of a state referendum was very strong. So in other words, how to create a new state? So what appeared possible was some kind of federation, a centralized federation of 9 Malay states, together with the Swiss settlements, federated Malay states, unfederated Malay states, and establishment of constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy along with the President's model. Now, then the contestation, right? We have got the British initiated proposal in June 1946. The British set up the Constitutional Working Committee, 12 members, 6 British representatives, 4 from the Malay rulers, 2 from UMNO, and they make proposals. And their proposals, though revised later on, became the basis for the Federation of Malaya Agreement 1948. And the details you can see there. A Federation of Malaya to replace the Malay Union, 9 Malay states plus Penang plus Malacca without Singapore. Okay. It was announced in December 1946. And there were others. I won't go into details. On the question of citizenship, the proposal by the British was a new Malayan citizenship, which was not to be a nationality. Right? How to acquire citizenship is stated there. I won't go into details. Now, what I just want to highlight is the alternative proposals by Putra AMCJA and Putra AMCJA. Putra constituted of Parti Bangsa Melayu Malaya, Angkatan Api Awas Barisan Tani Malaya and all that, with about 180,000 odd members. Right? Now, AMCJA was a larger federation. But what's important is that Putra MCAJ proposals a united Malaya inclusive of Singapore. That was the biggest difference between the two proposals. Right? On the question of what should constitute the state and the territory and the people. So we asked, why did the British want to exclude Singapore? The usual reason given is it will increase the demographic factor. More Chinese will upset the English. True, but there was a strategic reason that the British were planning to withdraw from Burma and India, and they wanted to retain Singapore as a center to oversee their strategic interests in the Southeast Asia. That's why they don't want to release Singapore to be part of the new federation. They want to continue controlling it from London. That was the main reason. Okay. Now, Putra MCAJ wanted Singapore as country. And another important point is that there's one important point in Putra MCAJ proposal, which is also very different from the British proposal, the Constitutional proposal, also on the question of nationality and citizenship. That in section 2 of the proposal, it states that this citizenship shall be as nationality to be termed Melayu and shall carry with it the duty of allegiance to the Federation of Malaya, but it assures that the term Melayu shall have no religious implications whatsoever. That was a proposal by Putra MCAJ. Right? Now, if you see the proposal just now, it is number 9. The term Melayu should be the title of any citizenship on national status in Malaya. Okay. Now, this Melayu is different from the definition of Melayu that was later to be found in the Federation of Malaya Constitution. The Melayu defined in the Constitution is one who professes to be a Muslim, habitually speaks the Malay language, and adheres to Malay customs, and all that. So the identity markers are language, custom, religion. Melayu concept of Putra MCJ is a political concept, not an ethnic concept. So it indicates the openness of the Malay proposal. I mean, the term Malay in the proposal by Putra MCJ. Okay. Now I want to highlight in this part the way of arriving at the proposals, the two models of consultation and engagement between the British representative of the Malay rulers and UMNO representative on the one hand, and the Putra MCA model of engagement on the other. Now, you can see, I think the idea about how to bring people together, I think is very important. Now, the British idea was to set up central working committees, but consists of a small group, and normally it's not open to the public for debate. Once they have got the ideas, then when people want to give views, then they set up a committee to collect views. Now, so this is the British approach. They set up a small committee, they formulate the ideas, and then they publish the views, and then when people protest, they set up what we call it, constitutional consultative committee, consultative method, right? Consultative method, right? To collect views from interested individuals, communities, and groups in Malaya on the constitutional proposals. Now, the Putra MCA approach is different. You cannot invite interested individuals, communities, and groups, according to them, but we should invite representatives of those and only those who regard Malaya as a real home and as the object of their loyalty. So there is a difference in regarding who should give their views to the committee. So, in short, the Putra AMCAJ approach, the consultation and engagement was bottom up. It was a genuine attempt at forging unity of various ethnic and religious groups, between gender and between various classes, namely the peasants and workers, who constitute the backbone of the pre-Merdeka society. And this is something unprecedented in the country's history. And the coalition of these anti-colonial forces was a clear example of a very broad-based kind of cooperation. Now, what is the significance of the Putra MCA model of cooperation and consultation? I listed down four here. One, it was an inter-ethnic coalition that was unprecedented in the country's history, showing the formula for future inter-ethnic unity and cooperation. Two, it was an inclusive multi-stakeholder coalition, workers, peasants, women, youth, intellectuals, businessmen, and so on. Three, it was a coalition of organizations based on shared principles and democratic consultations, guided by the spirit of mutual respect, compromise, and acceptance as the key to the success of negotiations and cooperation. And four, it was a coalition with an imagination, which they also conceptualized in some detail through the People's Constitutional Proposal, an envisioning of the nation from below that had to compete with the top-down envisioning that was proposed through the British initiated Constitutional Working Committee proposals. But though I regard that as very significant, but I think there are important questions also for reflection, and I put them forth. One, was the Putra AMCGA coalition deeply grounded? That's an important question for us to reflect. I'm going to answer here. Two, was there an element of triumphalism? Was there an element of triumphalism and overestimation by Putra AMCGA of its own strength, and underestimation of the British would-be response when these two different models and proposals came to a head-on collision? Three, what about the ideas in the People's Constitutional Proposal vis-à-vis the Working Committee's proposal? I mean, in terms of the substance of the ideas. And four, did the Putra AMCGA underestimate the divisive potency of the race paradigm and place too much hope and confidence in the viability of the class paradigm? And it pose this for questions for reflections. Now the British response, we all know, right? They went ahead with the revised proposals that they made and instituted the Creation of Malaya Agreement on 1st February 1948. That's the first. It's a comprehensive two-pronged response. One, went ahead with what they wanted to do in terms of that state framework that they created. Second, they used force by declaring the emergency in June that year, accompanied by mass arrest, banning of the various organizations under Putra, MCJA, and all that. So, and the rest is history. We all know that happened. But post 1948, after the lull of the mass arrest, we see the formation of the CLC, the Community Liaison Committee in 1949. Tan Cheng Lock was the chair of the MCJA. He was not arrested. The Community Liaison Committee was formed at the initiative of Dr. McDonald. Members were from UMNO, Wong Jaafar, Tan Cheng Lock, Singham, and 12 other members. And it is this liaison committee, the Community Liaison Committee, that debated further the question of citizenship. But the others who were in Putra and CPA were not included, and of course they were, some were in prison, some in the jungle, and some went to Singapore. Okay, to conclude, what I'm trying to show here is that the ideas that triumphed were those that were supported and enforced by power. Ideas that perished or sidelined were those opposed and suppressed, including by force. But, I think the but is important, some ideas don't simply die. Rather, they receive or fade away. And I think that's why we are discussing it here, right? They come back. Now, some historians call it residue, historical residue. Leftover. I don't like the historical residue term because it sounds like a leftover, right? It's not the main menu. So, but anyway, I think it's correct. They don't disappear. They fade away, lying in the wings, so to speak. So despite the 6 decades of independence and all that, we hear this unity coming back. And I think this project is one of the ways of retrieving those ideas that we have, been out for quite some time. Some people say there is struggle over history. I think it's right. It's a struggle. And I quote Riza with permission. History is very much a political battleground. Yes, it's true. History is a construction, written and institutionalized, especially by those with power or sanctioned by power. Dominant history has been written by the victors about their leaders, about their ideas, about their actions and glories, while history of the losers has either been maligned, distorted, buried, or forgotten. The winners write history, the losers write poetry or memoirs. As they said. But there is rising awareness regarding the significance of our histories, including people's history. So it's very important to and I use a term here, I borrow from Milner, hermeneutic retrieval. It's quite a fascinating concept, hermeneutic retrieve, to retrieve from the debris of history ideas that are still relevant for today, especially ideas that have been suppressed, ideas that have been cast aside, been maligned, regarded as subversive or whatever, and to bring to the fore, ideas to rethink afresh whether these ideas are of value to us. But at the same time, I would like to remind what Colin Wood says. I think historians know very well who Colin Wood is, a very famous historian. The important role of agency is not just ideas. there must be agents or agency to articulate and fight for these values. So, and conclude on the note that to know history, we need to also emphasize the internals of history, the thought of the human makers of history, by grasping and reliving the thought of the makers of history. So on that note, friends, terima kasih.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Prof. I'm Chin Wat from Penang Institute. Two questions. In discussing the post-Second World War design, you pointed out that the main questions were between federalism, unitary states, monarchy, or republic. I wonder whether that is really the fundamental question. I can't help to ask that the real question was actually about citizenship. To ask that who are we, the nation? Eventually, it's a question of can we be one if we are different? Can we be equal if we are different? That idea goes down to the non-assimilations of the non-Malays compared to immigrants from Sumatra or Jawas or Sulawesi. My second question is on the People's Constitution. Many people plot that as a very viable alternative, exactly because of point number 9, Melayu as an inclusive identity for nationality. But then, as is pointed out, that is religiously neutral. But it doesn't touch on the other aspect of assimilation, that's language. It merely mentioned that Malay language would be the national language, but that doesn't go further on the practical details, whether the vernacular education system would be remain or not. And I think those are issues that eventually come down that we need to deal with. So I'd like to seek enlightenment from you. Thanks, Prof.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Chin Wat. I think the two questions that you pose are very important questions. Whether the fundamental question after the Second World War was on citizenship or on the form of states. And second, about the proposals by the MCJ about the concept of Melayu, is it assimilationist or it's not? I mean, whilst it was religiously neutral, in terms of religion it was neutral, but question of language as an element of assimilation. I mean, that's basically what you say, right? Now, I put it this way, that in the heat of the time, in the post-World War II situation, where the leaders were mainly young, in their 20s or 30s, not like some of us today who are in the 7 series, 8 series even, who have time for reflection. There were people on the ground in action. Of course, they were thinkers. Yes, no doubt about it. Young thinkers, young leaders, visionaries. And I think to think of the form of states at that time, I mean, a republic was ours, right? A union, I mean, a unitary state, a federal state which is more centralized. I think that they had to grapple with that. Citizenship comes together with the state. Without the state, you cannot talk about citizens. Right? So you want to have what? A federation. A federation because they have got to take into account of the existence of the nine Malay kingdoms or the 9 states under the respective sultans. Now, some people argue that actually the prototype of federation was Negeri Sembilan. They have 9 negeri. The idea of the federation was already there in the 1890s, let's say, in Negeri Sembilan or 1880s. But of course, yeah, there were other prototypes of federation. So I think the idea of the federation then was viable. So having decided on what form of state it would be, then we have to decide on the question of citizenship, the position of the various people there. Now it was a tough question, definitely faced by the people then. And I think, if you notice, Putra AMCJA tried to address that in a way that they thought would take into account the historical dimension of the region, and at the same time taking into account the emerging new realities. That means taking into account the Chinese, the Indians, and the others who have got to come together to form a new nation. Now, in their view then, the term Melayu was perhaps the most, what do you call that, the idea that people could come together at that stage and to have a new, religiously neutral concept at the time, I think was good. But why Malay? I think it is a given fact that it is the common language of the region and we need Malay. But was it assimilationist? I think the document is silent on that. The document is silent on that. I think we have got to give that the benefit of the doubt. Whether it becomes assimilationist or not is the practice later. But I think the intention was not assimilationist. I think my reading of it was not assimilationist. But to have something to bring people together, otherwise how could you communicate? And the requirement of Malay was not even a fluent Malay. What do you call that? An everyday ability to communicate in Malay was sufficient, if my reading of it was correct. So, giving the benefit of the doubt, I mean, to those given that they were constrained by the fact of the heat of the time, I think that was a very advanced idea of the age. But again, I mean, those questions you have raised are correct in light of the present. You know, I mean, I raised more questions about the Putra MCADA too. You know, but I think we have got to. Well, I think there are one or two left among the proposal writers. I mean, only one person left. I said, only Lim Kian Chai, right? He's still around. If you want to ask, you know, but I don't think you can talk about it now. I think that's my quick response, right? I mean, that the others yes, questions.
Comments. Two comments. One, well, underneath what Rahman spoke, I think is the emphasis on the need for writing an alternative history, the people's history. Now, I happen to chair a center in which Rahman and Osuka are also members. This is a little bit of propaganda actually, of people called the People's History Center or Pusat Sejarah Rakyat. And our main idea is in fact to publish and to give alternative to the history that, as Rahman mentioned just now, is the history of those victors rather than losers. Now, I think out of this conference, if it is possible, we should further emphasize and spread the idea of the need of the people's alternative history, which deny many of the things that have been talked about by Rahman and also mentioned in the questions by Tingwa. Secondly, now, the Putra MCJA was actually the first coalition against colonialism. And in fact, the first coalition of its kind against any form of power that ruled until this day. That was a multi-ethnic, inter-ethnic coalition. basically, the British could be defeated only by such inter-ethnic coalition. Just as I believe that the present ruling power can only be defeated by an inter-ethnic coalition. The left, it so happens, as expressed in the coalition of 2028, had always been wanting unity and fighting against inter-ethnic strife. There are a lot of records that I have read in the record office which show that especially after the Second World War, there were a lot of inter-ethnic strife in different areas. And it was people like Isa Muhammad, Burhanuddin, Mustamam, Abdul Asidi, and it's strange that his name has not been mentioned today, Abdul Asidi. These were people who went to the areas who stopped the conflict, the racial conflict, and they succeeded. Now, the spirit of snuffing racial conflict and building unity was the spirit of the left, was the spirit of the nationalists also. And it was not the intention of the British. The British, their policy was to divide and rule. And because of the policy of divide and rule, we can never imagine the colonial powers, the British in this case, wanting, for instance, a true nation state with citizenship that is equal and fair. Thank you.
And that the use of the history of ideas, I think, is quite a powerful tool to address three nagging problems in history, in the writing of history of Malaysia. One, I think, using the history of ideas that occurred and is still developing, I think you can stress the importance of paradigms. The colonial paradigms which predominate the writing of history is a powerful, has a powerful explanatory power. But along the way, I think it may distort what Rahman wants in his attempt to deal with the envisioning of the nation. And also with the history ideas that Rahman has put forward, I think we are able to counter the trend in effacing ideology from the analysis of history. And the third point is, I think to me, is the most important point is, with the history of ideas that Rahman has put forward, I think we are able to recognize two things. One is the structural precedents that occurred much earlier than the British colonialism period, and also the cultural precedents of the Malay world. And I think these are all together, I think they are necessary in his effort at envisioning the nation. Thank you very much.
Aligned to work with the Japanese, hoping for independence through under the the Japanese help. On the other hand, you have the MCP, including Abdul Siddiq and so on, going into fighting the Japanese. So how's that part being dealt with? Were they debated between the left? Because we just look at a lot of things like as if all those things people just move on, but I think there's a lot of contradictions in between. So again, I'll see you in Latin. Thanks.
Okay, William Yap from Singapore. Actually, at the moment you're talking about Singaporeans, you talk to young Singaporeans. The concept of Malaya, or the reunification of Malaya and Singapore, is unimaginable. to say the least. And yes, if you talk about Malaya, I think the concept of Malaya would include Singapore until 1946. So I did ask this same question, actually, I did ask Rahman this question some time back. So how do you consider, or how do you place, where do you place Singapore? And this concept of imagine, or what you call conceptualized Malaya. Okay, we are reviving this idea. I think it's a very good, it's a very, very good move, very good kind of debate. And I'm going to pose this same question again, the envision Malaya. Where do you place Singapore in this context? Because even though in Singapore it's unimaginable, but among the left, or the what we call veteran leftists, this concept has not faded away at all. We're still discussing it. So what is your vision? Thank you.
The student movement called the Federation of Malaysia and Singapore Students Organization, FIOMSO, SS, Singapore included. So in the vision of the young then, Singapore was on the radar screen of the envisioning of the unified nation. And I suppose since 1960s, 70s, 40 years down the road, 40, 50 years down the road, the envisioning of Singapore as part and parcel of the region has gone, right, from the imagination of the young of today. And I think if we really want to bring back that idea, I think it goes back to what Syed was talking about earlier on, the need for the unpacking and the rewriting of history, to put it along the lines that we have been discussing about, that the indivisibility of that part, of Singapore, of Malaya, and so on and so forth, that we were one. And of course, the political interests divide this, and the political interests and the ignorance and the prejudices that develop in the course of that continue with the two separate entities. But of course, in the future, I mean, we do not know what will happen in the future, but now we have ASEAN. Right? We didn't think of it. ASEAN's creation in 1967 was an anti-communist organization, but it has been transformed into something else now, with the former enemies becoming part and parcel of ASEAN too, Vietnam and all that, right? And they're supposed to have an ASEAN community by next year, supposed to have, with Malaysia, the chair, and all that, right? Now, I think the envisioning for the future has got to be, has got to be based on history, and the process of it has got to be along the lines of retrieving those ideas into writing of history again. But what form will it be? Will it be Malaya or Malaysia including Singapore in the form that was proposed then, or a new form? I think what matters now is more the unity amongst the peoples first. That the peoples of Malaysia, and Singapore have got to think that they are related one way or the other and not separated. I think that the idea has got to be set in. Now, there is now what we call it, Singapore has imposed taxes, as for vehicles going, and Malaysia has retaliated by raising the toll and all. I mean, these are irritants. These are irritants along the way. But I think if we have that larger vision of educating the young, not only the young, but the young of yesterday, and the young of today, and the young of tomorrow. But I think the education has got to be cast within a wider framework and not just Malaysia, Singapore, or Malaysia, Singapore. that's got to be within a larger framework of Southeast Asia or ASEAN. I think that has got to be for the future. I mean, to look at just Malaya and Singapore, I think will be, for the future, I think it will be too, I mean, too tight, too cast in history once we want to move forward. So I think along a bigger vision, I think maybe more technical. I think that's Riyad's question. Qinghua, the divide into life strategy. I think if my reading is correct, the cooperation with the Japanese was tactical. That Ibrahim Yaakob and his friends also had links with MPAJA. Was fighting, the MPAJA was fighting against the Japanese. And Mana was a contact person with MPAJA from his organization. Mana, I think. So in other words, it was a two-pronged strategy on the part of Ibrahim Yaakob, Mustafa Hussein, and the others. And this is verified by Abdul Sidi. Syed Hussein complained just why Abdul Sidi's name was not mentioned. Well, Abdul Sidi was not one of those who advocated Melayu Raya. I think that's why his name was not mentioned.
Yeah.
And he was too young to be. He was a member of the Kesatuan Melayu Muda. But a very young member because he was still in school in the late 30s. Right? But Ibrahim Yaakob claimed that on tactically, openly, he worked with the Japanese. Mustafa Hussein worked with the Japanese in order to fight for this independence. Right? But in his writings, he did say that he also had people working together with MPAJA. So in that sense, I mean, tactics and strategies are complicated,
Sure.
and you can discuss. I mean, it's not that straightforward. And I think under those circumstances, they thought that was the right thing to do. Right? Okay. And whether there was a discussion? Yes, there was discussion.
Can you just ask a bit further? I mean, very briefly. I think the question is not about to judge the decision that, because we didn't live in their time, we cannot make any fair judgment on that ground. But my curiosity comes back to the title, Envisioning the Nation. So for Ibrahim Yaakob would have been Melayu Raya, but would CPM sign up to that? That was the backbone of AMCJ. So that was, I'm sure that, I'm convinced that there would be tactical connections and cooperation, but the larger question was, were those things discussed? Thanks.
I think Melayu Raya was not discussed. I think Melayu Raya was not discussed, but what was discussed was Malaysia's independence. I think because the Melayu Raya idea, more or less, the first phase of Melayu Raya ended in 1945 when the Japanese surrendered, and they couldn't push through the idea of an independent Indonesia and Malaya together. Right? And then PKMM was formed in October 1945 with Mukhtaruddin Lasso as the chair, the first president. And Mukhtaruddin Lasso was a member of the CPM. Right? Now, he left after 6 months, but he took over. But a number of the CPM members were also members of PKMM. But PKMM at that time already talked about an independent Malaya. And the idea of Melayu Raya was in the background.
I see.
So as my reading and what I know about this is that Melayu Raya was not the envisioned nation of CPM. Or rather, it was not discussed between CPM and the Malaya. But what was discussed was what would the independent Malaya, the would-be independent Malaya be like. I think that and what were the strategies to be taken together, I think that was discussed.
I
I did ask Ken Chai about Malaya Raya, and it was not discussed. 2, Ishako told me personally that he had contact with the anti-Japanese forces. Who was that? Ishako. Ishako. Sorry, I call him Ishako because Ishako. I mean, we call him Ishako because that was what he was referred to at that time, because he was working with Japanese. So it becomes Ishako. I'm sorry. I mean, I know him quite well, and I call him Ishako. So he confirmed that during the Japanese time, when he was working with the Japanese, he was in contact with the anti-Japanese forces. That's 2 points. The third point is, I don't quite agree with your length of time about Singapore coming back. I think we should think a bit more about the economic factors, apart from the history and social factors. And Iskandar's scheme is not something which Singapore would enter and put capital into if there's not to Singapore's necessity and need. So that's something for thought. And lastly, just you said something about is it visitors or in Malayu, right? In the concept of Malayu nation. You said something about that, about people from Sumatra, and you said that they were regarded as visitors or something like that. There is to me a parallel between the Chinese during the feudalistic times when there was a conglomeration of Chinese states, and we call them the Hakka people. Current, you think there's a parallel between that and those that came to Malaya or Malayu region, the concept of Malayu region. That's all. Thanks.
One point to clarify a question asked by Rahman. Now, the cooperation, as I see it, between the Malay nationalists, the progressive nationalists, with the Japanese, I think was quite a superficial tactical arrangement out of necessity. And why do I say it is superficial? If I can remember the biography written by Mustafa Hussain, who is one of the characters mentioned by Rahman, Mustafa Hussain said that on the verge of the Japanese defeat, when it was KMM approached the Japanese asking for independence from the British, straight away the Japanese banned KMM. So in other words, the Japanese was not interested in cooperating with KMM to get independence from the British. Otherwise they wouldn't have done that. Thank you.
Singaporean, wider imagination. Two things, because I wish if you were to know, furthering Keynote's question, what actually happened in Indonesia in 1965 between this older group of that KMM, right, and those on the full left, people like Samsa Fakir and stuff like that. There was something that was happening, I think, that haven't been truly registered. Whether it was a conflict, because in a sense, by that time, Ibrahim Yaakob under Iskandar Kamil was part of the Indonesian parliament or government, in that sense. And then there were this group of much more left people in Indonesia, and then they were arrested and then sent off to Vietnam or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. Right? The other thing I would want to highlight that what is the Malay land is never a monolithic entity. Right? It's quite a huge swing. I mean, you can say it's from pink to red, or you know. And the other thing is with regards to the collaboration or whatever in a sense with the Japanese. I think another person who highlighted it was Abdul in his memoirs or biography. Right? He did highlight about the extent of the, you know, and they knew that it was only for certain circumstances. Only.
After 1969, I do not know. And the incident that you referred to in 1965 is there was a group of CPM people in Indonesia under the National Liberation League, if I'm not mistaken, who were arrested by the Suharto forces and then sent back, which are sent out of the country to Vietnam and then back, and then to China. I think they were part of the delegation to propagate CPM struggle in various parts, you know, in Asia. I think in Indonesia, because Indonesia at that time had the largest communist party outside of China and the Soviet Union. I think that was their role. Samsul Fakir, Ibrahim Muhammad, Abdul Asudin, who else I can't remember. I think that's the group I think you are referring to. Yes. But whether Ibrahim Yaakob had any role to help them or not, I have no idea. I have no idea about that. Now, Dr. Kusuka's question about parallels in China, about Hakka, I'm not familiar with that issue. So I can't comment. I can't comment on that. Now, coming back to the more general questions or general comments by Dr. Samson Ali and my friend Khalid, I think, yes, the need for rewriting history, retrieving the ideas of the past that may be useful for the present and the future, I think is very vital. And that what Pusat Sejarah Raya is doing now on the side, and Dr. Kusuka, I think, attempts that should be supported. And we can work, should work together along these lines. And that the history of ideas as a tool of trying to relive or retrieve these ideas, I think is something that students of history must learn. I think, I don't know, I look at the curriculum, history curriculum in universities, but I think you have to verify whether I'm wrong. I think this is not part of the curriculum. I mean, the history curriculum in the universities tend to look at periods of history, but not on the history of ideas, whilst I think it should be. So we start to underline the importance of the subject, because then we can have a better grasp of history as an aid for us to understand the past, the present, and also to write the present as history, as Wong said. And I think if we do that, perhaps Kusuka's envisioning that it shouldn't be too long for Singapore and Malaysia to be together again. Maybe we may be able to come to that. Thank you.
I think we started slowly on the question discussion, but I think there are more questions now. Perhaps if you're fine, perhaps you can actually approach Prof. Rahman afterwards on your own. But I think all of us have benefited in one way or another from the discussion and also his sharing. And I think we should thank him in the usual manner. Thank you.